Yeah.
It's like,
I know. Someday you guys will figure out cool light.
Yeah. The first question would be how did you, I'm going to start. The first question, how did you meet Howard and your early days in the anti-war movement as you spoke together?
Well, never really remember when you met anyone, but I think we probably first met on the way down to Jackson, Mississippi was probably the first time there was a civil rights action there, and it was a lot of people had been thrown in jail, and there was a big hassle with the state police and the usual blow up, and several of us designated ourselves an inquiry commission of New England professors. I don't know on what basis, just to try to see if we could get some publicity for what was going down. And we went down and spent a couple of days together and went through the jails and spoke to people, went to the churches and saw what was going on, and then did manage to get some people in Congress interested in what was happening and a few other things. And after that, we just on and on. I can't remember how many things. The one time I ever went to Congress for lobbying was with Howard and a couple other people, and then just constant talks and meetings and demonstrations and arrests and the whole routine until the present. Saw him a couple of weeks ago.
Deb had a really good question, and she might be the best one to ask this, isn't I think no, okay, I'll ask it. Is that, why do you think that of you and Howard's generation, Jewish intellectual community, what became so involved in a lot of it became maybe more Howard. I don't know.
Well, Howard is. There is a category of people who call themselves New York intellectuals, who are mostly Jewish, but Howard's about as remote from that as you can imagine. He comes from he comes from a working class background. He's been an activist all his life. He's not the kind of intellectual who hangs around literary soirees and sort of try to impress each other with how bright they are and get invited to the best parties and that sort of thing. That's just not his life. That's the New York intellectuals. But he comes from a completely different background that had a totally different history, an activist history, also an academic history, but it's all entwined with his engagement and activism and involvement in real issues that matter to people. And he's always available. He doesn't find the fancy lectureships and the five-star hotels and that kind of thing. He goes to where people need him. Activist groups, student groups, organizers, poor people's meetings, or on the streets. That's not the usual picture of what an elite intellectual is.
I wasn't thinking so much actually of the elite. I was thinking more of the communist, the radical, fringe. But
yeah,
that was,
well, he
it
came.
was just
That's
something
his right. Well, he's carried that through in a way in which intellectuals typically have not in recent years. There was a time when the radical movements did have deep involvement of intellectuals, but it hasn't been much true in recent years. Howard's, in that sense, a kind of throwback. Kept the faith. And this has nothing to do with being involved in a party or anything else. It's just being involved and engaged in people's lives and problems and struggles, which is pretty rare. There are people like that. Eugene Debs and a couple others, but it's rare.
His view of history is like, as you know, like the total bottom. What interests me, both the parallel, both of you, yourself and Howard, is that you talk about how a lot about how the media spins things and what we hear on the news, and he talks about that in the context of history. Could you just talk a little bit about how history is power? in relation to?
Well, history is owned by the wealthy and the privileged. They craft a version of history that serves the interests of the powerful. Actually, I write more about that than I do about the media, but it's, the media is one aspect of it. It's just the daily aspect. But for example, Howard's book was so important because it was, for one of the rare occasions on which a view of history was given that broke sharply from the conventions of subordination to power, looked at what history meant to the mass of the population. It's sometimes done, but he did it brilliantly and in an unusual way, and tries to make history something that people can understand and use for their own purposes, not be subordinated and subjected to for someone else's purposes.
Why do you think he connects so much with people, especially young people? I followed him around, and I'm awed.
Well, he connects with everyone. We've been on every imaginable, spoken to every imaginable audience I can think of, from academic seminars to, rallies in the midst of a huge hubbub, to small groups of students, to mass audience on the Boston Common. But wherever it is, he somehow manages, like no one I've ever seen, to get exactly the right tone that will, both at the level of the content, the style, and so on, that will bring people out, make them want to listen and think and pursue it and interact and so on. I've never seen anyone able to do that. I certainly can. We've talked all over the place, but he's got a unique talent.
And he said that you guys complemented
Yeah,
each
we
other
do.
very
We
well.
found that we're a pretty good pair because we're pretty different in style.
Could you explain that a little?
Well, if you hear it sometime, it'll be obvious. We're very much in sync in the way we see the world and understand things and so on, but we kind of approach it from other opposite ends, like I'm talking footnotes and factual analysis and so on, and he's doing the same thing, but with a very human touch that makes it all very real and meaningful to people. And somehow we do succeed in complementing each other very well. We felt that we were successful when we gave talks in which I couldn't have done it.
You both come out of that, not come out of, but you're there in the 1950s when it's sort of I was just reading, I just bought the book and I read Howard's chapter and I read your chapter about the Cold War and McCarthyism in academia. And what Howard said at the end of that I thought was really fascinating about how there's become almost a permanent adversarial role by people that wasn't there before. How there was a small group in the 50s and now that's a huge part. How did that come about, and what do you think Howard's contributions to that were?
Well, he had first of all, he had a huge contribution in the South when he was one of the very few. The Southern intellectuals were very supportive of our version of apartheid. They didn't object to it. Either they kept quiet, either they openly supported it or they kept quiet. The number of people, I just read an academic article comparing the attitude of South African intellectuals to apartheid and Southern intellectuals to our version, Southern racism, and it's remarkably similar. The amount of, this is a scholarly article, so it gives a lot of details, but the amount of deviation was very slight. There was tolerance and quiet and a general point of view of either support or else it's not our business. Our business is to, do our work. Howard was, as he's always been, complete exception to that. And he had a huge effect on the early stages of the black student movement. A lot of the people who were the leading activists were his students. In fact, as you know, he got thrown out of the university for that, and that was very rare. And then he went on to have the same kind of effect on the other movements of the 60s as they developed. Virtually all of them. Wherever something was happening, Howard was up in front, speaking, acting, participating, part of it, bringing his own special knowledge and understanding, which is rich and important, but also his direct personal involvement, which is tremendously important. I again can't think of anyone in the any of these areas who had anything like that influence.
What awes me is that, he was so willing to take risks.
And his book alone just changed the thinking of a whole generation of people. I can't think of another book that has had that much of an impact. It just gave a totally different perspective on how to look at the world, how to look at ourselves, where we came from, what we grew out of, what our responsibilities are. And it did it in a way which people could really read and understand. It's the kind of book we gave to our children, for instance, which there are, and then you read it again as an adult and you're learning from it. There aren't many things like that.
It met a lot of opposition, though, didn't it?
The book?
Yeah. It stepped on some, toes.
Oh, sure. I'm sure he's not the most popular person in the profession. But I don't think he cares, he's just living in a different world.
Could you, maybe I should ask someone from Boston and pass on it if you would, but I think of the film that was about you and Silver. He that wasn't a friendly relationship.
I think Howard and I were probably very high on his enemies list, if not on the top. And Howard had a lot of problems. Howard had real trouble with him because he was Silver was in a position where he could influence what happened around Howard's life. He can tell you the details, but he's a very vicious person, and he practically he virtually told the department that he would destroy it unless they got rid of him. He's a very vicious, vindictive person. And in my case, it's just a joke. Don't care what he does.
The one thing I like about Howard is how things end up on a positive note. When we were editing a trailer, what I couldn't believe, and I went back to look at the interviews of how everything is so organized, unlike me, but how each answer would have a beginning, middle, and end.
He's thought hard about things. He doesn't accept easy answers. He's got a lifetime of engagement, which he brings to all of these things. It's been true of everything. Like you asked about his influence. He was the first person to write seriously about, make the obvious proposal that was considered outlandish at the time, namely that we should withdraw from Vietnam. In a way shouldn't be more outlandish than somebody saying the Russians ought to withdraw from Afghanistan, but nobody was doing it. And when his book came out, I think 1966 or so, there wasn't it was so inconsistent with the drift of thinking and understanding that most people couldn't even read it. They couldn't read the words. But it had its impact, through young people, through activists, and it finally was one of the major contributions to building up a popular movement, which unfortunately didn't quite have that effect, but at least constrained and limited the destruction of the country that we were attacking.
He talks about, and I've asked him about how when you spoke with him, it came to there was 100 people, and then some years later.
100? When we began, I remember talks in the early 60s when there would be 4 people in a church, 2 of them drunks who walked in, one the organizer, and a 4th one who wanted to kill you, This went on for a long... here at MIT, into about as late as 1965, I guess. If we were or in Cambridge generally, if we were trying to have a meeting on Vietnam, we would often bring together 4 or 5 topics. Vietnam, Venezuela, Iran, women's rights, Vietnam, then maybe we get 10 people out. Actually, the first time that he and I spoke together in a I think he was one of the speakers, I forget, on the Boston Common in October 1965. October 15th, 1965 was the first International Day of Protest, it was called. I was supposed to be one of the speakers, I think he was another, on the Common, but it was impossible. I mean, we were practically killed. If there hadn't been a couple hundred state troopers around, the crowd probably would have, I don't know what would have happened. But we certainly couldn't get a word out. It was just shouted down, mostly students, incidentally. And the state troopers weren't protecting us because they liked what we were saying, but they just didn't want to see people murdered on the Boston Common, or else their boss didn't. But that was it. You take a look at the Boston Globe the next day, or if you could pick up the radio the next day, it was bitterly denouncing these people who dared to stand up and criticize, the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam and so on. And this is October 1965. We had already been at war with South Vietnam for 4 years at that point. And that continued. I mean, the next major action, popular action, the International Day of Protest, was must have been around April 1966, so like 5 months later. Well, we decided then not to have it outdoors because it was just going to be too dangerous. We didn't want the violence and so on, so we decided to have it in a church. And there was a march and then a meeting, 2 churches. One was the Arlington Street Church, and then there was an overflow, was another church. Well, the churches were attacked. I mean, the churches were attacked by crowds who were throwing cans and, projectiles and tomatoes and so on. I remember very well standing on the front step of the Arlington Street Church and there was a police captain standing near me. I was just watching, seeing what are they going to do, And he got hit in the face with a tomato, the police captain. And then about 2 minutes later, the crowd was gone, gave some order or something, and they all dispersed. But I've always figured it must have been one of our guys that threw it. But that's what it was like into 1966. Incidentally, that's about when Howard's book came out on pulling out of Vietnam. Now, at that point, by mid-1966, things were beginning to change. Incidentally, remember, this is Boston I'm talking about. This is a liberal city, It's not, the center of a bunch of air bases in Georgia or something. And the same was happening everywhere. My wife and kids, 2 little girls, then went to a women's demonstration in Concord, Mass. Not a major center of violence. This would have been about the same time, I guess, 1966, and they're just women and children, walking around quietly, no talks or anything. I mean, they were attacked. The shift that took place in the country is quite dramatic in a year or two. I mean, a year or two later it was all totally different. I mean, then you have hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in huge mobs, and the country blowing up, and so on and so forth. But it was all within a couple of years. And Howard was one of the very few people who had a major impact on that. I mean, how it happened, I honestly don't know. I was right in the middle of it, but I don't think anybody understands how it happened. But there was a very sharp change. The country was extremely jingoist. I mean, if you just think what happened, I mean, what happened was the support for the atrocities was so enormous that they literally are out of history. So, for example, you ask your friends when they think the United States attacked South Vietnam. What's the date? Most people don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean when the United States attacked South Vietnam? We defended South Vietnam. Unwisely, you say, if you're a dove. But when did we attack South Vietnam? That's like not a sentence in the English language. Well, there happens to be a date when we attacked South Vietnam, namely late 1961, early 1962, when John F. Kennedy, who was a major killer, sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnamese civilians, authorized the use of napalm, authorized crop destruction, so to try to undermine the support for the indigenous guerrillas, nobody else but South Vietnamese, and initiated what became one of the hugest ethnic cleansing programs of modern times. They didn't use the word then, but just driving by violence, bombing and other violence, driving millions of people out of the countryside, either into concentration camps, which they called strategic hamlets, or just into urban slums. All of that started in the early 60s. In fact, South Vietnam was always the main target of the U.S. attack. When the bombing of the North officially began in February 1965, the bombing of the South went on at triple the scale. It was escalated at triple the scale right then. And there was some protest about the bombing of the North, but not the bombing of the South. And if the U.S. wants to destroy another country, that's fine. Nobody's business but ours. That's changed. And no American president could possibly get away with what Kennedy got away with in 1961. Actually, Reagan tried. Reagan probably didn't know what was going on, but the people around Reagan tried to duplicate their hero, Kennedy, in 1981. You could see them do it. They were planning a big attack in Central America, and they went through exactly the same steps that the Kennedy administration went through. Same white paper, the same propaganda, just virtually a duplication. Trying to build up attack in Central America, attack on Nicaragua, and so on. The press went along completely, never questioned it, but the public reacted. There was an unanticipated public reaction. People protested all over the place. It was church groups, other groups. Finally, the Reagan administration backed off because they were afraid that the public protest, which they had not anticipated, would undermine programs more important to them, like the huge armaments program and so on. So they backed off. They told the press to cool it. And a couple of months later, the press started criticizing the white paper and kind of backed off. And they never did literally invade Central America. They had to resort to a huge clandestine terror operation, which was bad enough, but B-52s are worse. That was whatever the change was, it was significant, and it's lasting. And it's kind of interesting to see how educated people cannot comprehend it. So, for example, for years there's been regular polls on all kinds of foreign affairs issues, but one of them always is, what do you think about the war in Vietnam? Since these polls have been taken from about 1970 to the present, the most recent one was just a few months ago, a large majority of the population, usually around 70%, has described the war as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Now that distinguishes 70% of the population from virtually every educated person. I mean, among educated people, almost nobody describes the war that way. I mean, the most dovish, of them say, well, it was a mistake. But 70% of the population is off the spectrum. They think it was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. And it's an interesting figure because almost everyone made that up for themselves. They never read it anywhere, or unless they read one of Howard's books. But the chances that they ever heard it or read it are very slight. But that's just people's own experience. Now it's kind of interesting to see how this is interpreted. The editor of the series where these things comes out gives a nice person, nice scholarly, decent type. Gives an interpretation of the findings, and when his interpretation of this is that the American population doesn't want to bear the burdens of foreign intervention. That's not what people are saying. They're not saying we don't want to bear the burdens of foreign intervention. They're saying we're against aggression and violence and terror. But if you're an educated person, you can't hear those words. Well, again, Howard is a very unusual exception. That separates him from most of the, educated sectors. Elite, certainly. Historians, undoubtedly.
Oh, yeah, because you're...
We're getting dragged out.
I have one quick question. He talks a lot about the responsibilities of knowledge and the responsibilities, and yourself, too. Going out there and speaking about that. What is the responsibilities of knowledge for people like Howard Zinn and people like yourself and other intellectuals?
I don't think there's anything profound to say about that. I mean, if we consider ourselves moral human beings, whatever we are, we have a responsibility to do what we can to alleviate human problems, to help people who are in pain, to improve the situation of the world, and we can do different things. I mean, if we happen to be if we happen to be somebody like me, for example, way too much privilege, ridiculous amount of privilege, it's obscene. Opportunities, education, resources, and so on. Well, responsibility is to use them. If your talents and capabilities and opportunities lie elsewhere, your responsibility is to use them. I don't think there's anything that can't be understood by a 10-year-old, to say about these topics.
Okay.